Hello, my friend. Welcome to your sleep story. Tonight, we visit the most boring hotel in the world. We will learn about its wonderfully boring staff and its incredibly boring guests. And hopefully, it is just the right amount of warmth and boringness to put you to sleep with a smile on your face. Before tonight's story begins, let's take a few minutes together just to let go, to arrive here with me in this moment. I am going to count down from 10 to 1, and as I do, allow yourself to let go a little more with every number. 10. Feel the support of whatever you are lying on tonight. The bed beneath you, the pillow beneath your head, and beneath that, feel the constant, steady support of the earth itself. This support is always there. The earth has been holding you your entire life, and it holds you now. As you become aware of that, see if you can let go just a little more. Release anywhere you might be holding. Your shoulders, your jaw, your hands. 9. You are safe tonight. Allow my voice to be a friend, a gentle guide that takes you toward comfort, toward peace, toward letting go. My voice will only ever take you to safe places, kind places, places of warmth and quiet wonder. 8. The day is done. Whatever has been, has been. Whatever will be, will be. Any thoughts you might have tonight about the past, about tomorrow, know that they are not needed right now. Don't fight them. Simply see them for what they are. Thoughts, not you, separate from you. Things that can easily drift away, like leaves on a moonlit river, or clouds passing through a starlit sky. 7. Peace lives within you. It is always there, a constant, quiet companion. It is simply waiting to be found, waiting to be felt. Tonight, see if you can find that peace. Let it glow gently within you. Let it pass slowly through your body from the top of your head to the tips of your fingers, to the soles of your feet, allowing your body and your mind to soften and let go. 6. This is your moment. This is your time. You deserve rest. You deserve peace. We all do. Allow that truth to help you let go even more, to ease into this very moment more and more. 5. You don't have to carry anything anymore. You have nowhere to go, nothing to do. Not in this moment. You are free. This is your time. Sink into that. Find the coziness in that. 4. Allow a little gratitude now if you can. Gratitude for the simple things, the shelter you have tonight, the warmth around you, the breath moving gently in and out of your body. 3. Begin to engage with your imagination. Picture a building, an incredibly ordinary-looking building. So ordinary, you might walk right past it and not even notice it was a hotel. But it is, and it is raining outside, and you are about to hear about the wonderfully quiet, wonderfully uneventful lives that exist behind these perfectly ordinary walls. 2. Check in with your body one more time. Your body has worked hard for you today. Every breath, every heartbeat, every step. It is time to give it the rest it has earned. And 1. completely letting go now as I tell you tonight's sleep story. The hotel sat quietly on its patch of road, a little back from the pavement, as if it had chosen to be polite about taking up space. Its windows were all exactly the same size, and exactly where you would expect them to be, lined up in neat rows that made the whole building look faintly serious. The curtains inside the windows were the same neutral shade from one end of the building to the other, and they hung so very still. It was hard to imagine anyone ever opening or closing them. The sign above the entrance simply read hotel, followed by the name of the street, as if it wanted no confusion about what it was or where it could be found. The letters had faded a little over the years, but remained clear enough to do their job. The car park out front contained a sensible number of spaces, most of which were usually occupied, though you rarely saw anyone actually getting in or out of a car. The entrance doors were the sliding kind, and they always seemed to take just a moment longer than you expected before opening. Never dramatically late, just enough to make you pause. Inside, you could just make out the shape of the reception desk, the neat little bowl of mints, and the faint, warm glow of the lamp that sat there year-round. Everything about it seemed to say, very gently, "This is fine." The hotel was run by a man named Kenneth. Kenneth had been the manager for 12 years, though if you asked him how long he'd worked there, he would have to stop and think. He had the sort of face that looked as though it had been designed to nod politely. His hair was always combed in the same direction, as though it had been told once what to do, and had never questioned it since. Working alongside Kenneth was Angela, who did most of the check-ins. Angela had perfected the art of handing over a key card without saying more than 3 words. Her tone was pleasant but unchanging, as though she had recorded herself once and was simply playing it back each time. She kept her hair in a neat bun that never seemed to loosen, even after a very long shift. There was also Martin, who worked nights. Martin enjoyed the night shift because it was the one time he could be sure nothing much would happen. His job consisted mostly of sitting behind the desk and listening to the quiet hum of the vending machine, occasionally getting up to walk the corridor, just to make sure the corridor was still there. The housekeeping staff were a quiet pair named Irina and Mela. They moved through the hotel at a steady, unhurried pace, carrying fresh towels and nodding to each other at regular intervals. They rarely spoke to guests unless asked something very specific, such as, "Do you have an extra pillow?" To which the answer was always yes. Paula oversaw breakfast. She moved at the same pace every morning, quietly lining up cups and setting out plates until the whole room looked ready to serve its purpose. Her eyebrows did most of her talking, a slight lift to indicate that fresh rolls had arrived, a small dip if the coffee machine was slower than usual. Christy was the chef, a man who liked to keep things predictable. His kitchen ran on a kind of gentle rhythm, chopping, stirring, tasting. He had exactly 3 dishes he was known for, and anyone who requested anything outside of that would receive one of the 3 dishes anyway. Victor was the handyman, though you would only ever see him if something had broken, and even then, only briefly, before the thing in question was fixed, and Victor had quietly vanished again. He seemed to know when a light bulb was about to flicker, before it actually did, and appeared almost magically to replace it. And finally, there was Lorana, who worked in the laundry room at the back of the building. No one was quite sure how she always knew which guests had requested extra towels before the requests were even made. But she did. When she spoke, it was in a quiet voice that carried perfectly through the linen room. And now let me tell you what a single day in the most boring hotel in the world looked like. At 6:43 in the morning, Martin wrote the words, "Quiet night," on the only sheet of paper he had used in 8 hours. He did not add a full stop. It seemed too final for that early in the morning. He placed the pen back in exactly the same groove on the desk, where it would wait patiently until the following night. Then he stood, stretched just far enough to make his back click once, and put on his coat. At 6:49, Kenneth arrived. He gave the lobby a slow glance, the kind of glance you give a room when you expect it to look the same, and it does. He shook out his umbrella from the rain outside, hung up his jacket, and walked with quiet urgency to the stack of brochures by the door. He pressed them with the flat of his hand, straightening them until the edges lined up like obedient soldiers. Someone had taken one about 2 weeks ago, and he wanted to be sure they were ready for the next person who might be interested. He then rotated the bowl of mints 1/2 inch so that the most colorful wrapper was facing the front. Satisfied, he nodded to Martin. Martin nodded back, handed him the paper, and left without saying another word. At 6:55, the first faint sound of Paula setting up breakfast reached the lobby, the soft clink of cups being placed exactly an inch apart. A moment later came the distant sigh of the coffee machine, as though the whole thing was working up the will to face another day. At 7:02, Christy appeared briefly in the kitchen doorway, holding 2 pans in one hand. Considering which one deserved to be used first, after a moment's thought, he chose the heavier one, placed it on the hob, and stood perfectly still until the extractor fan made its usual first cough of the morning. At 7:10, Irina and Mela wheeled their trolley along the upstairs hallway. The squeak in the front wheel was slightly louder than yesterday, which meant Victor would appear sometime this afternoon, kneel once, and fix it without breaking stride. At 7:15, Angela arrived, her shoes tapping out a rhythm that was by now as familiar to Kenneth as the ticking of the lobby clock. She put her bag under the desk, smoothed her bun with one precise movement, and took her place behind the computer, as though continuing a conversation she had been having with it the day before. By 7:20, the hotel was fully awake, or at least as awake as it ever got. The brochures were straight. The coffee was nearly ready, and the first guest would appear soon, shuffling sleepily toward the breakfast room, ready to supply the hotel with the one thing it existed for, a reason to keep doing all of this again tomorrow at 7:28. The first sound of movement came from the staircase, the slow, deliberate shuffle of slippers on carpet, followed by the faint clearing of a throat that suggested someone was coming, but wasn't in any hurry to arrive. A moment later, Mr. Ellis appeared, a man who had been staying at the hotel long enough to be on first-name terms with the breakfast buffet. He made his way to the same table he always chose, the one near the radiator, but not too near, and sat down without glancing at the menu. At 7:34, the first couple arrived, Mr. and Mrs. Finch. They entered together, but said nothing to each other, as though the act of arriving at breakfast had been thoroughly discussed in their room and required no further comment. Mr. Finch carried the room key in his hand, even though he wouldn't need it until he went back upstairs. Mrs. Finch glanced once around the room, nodded almost imperceptibly, and then sat at the same table they had used the day before. At 7:41, a young couple came in. They walked to the buffet together, taking it in turns to look at the bread rolls, as if they were choosing a pet. After a long pause, they each took one and returned to their table, looking faintly accomplished. At 7:47, the businessman appeared. He walked straight to the coffee machine, pressed the button twice, and stood perfectly still until it finished. Then he picked up the cup sipped and gave a small nod to himself, a nod that seemed to say, yes, this will do. He sat down at a table close to the door, as though he might leave at any moment, though he never actually did until breakfast was over. At 7:53, an elderly lady arrived, holding her handbag in both hands, as though it contained something very precious, though it almost certainly did not. She chose a table by the window, placed the handbag on the chair opposite her, and patted it once, as though reassuring it that it could stay there. At 8 o'clock, a mother and her young son came in. The boy immediately pointed to the cereal, then to the juice machine, then to the empty chair he wanted to sit in, all within about 3 seconds. His mother followed behind, carrying her plate as though it were a slightly risky experiment that she hoped would succeed. And finally, at 8:07, an older man arrived alone. He moved with the kind of quiet care that suggested he did not wish to disturb anything in the room, including the chairs. He chose a table in the far corner, placed his napkin on his lap, and sat completely still for a moment before beginning to think about what he would like to eat. Mr. Ellis was the first to move. He approached the toaster, selected one slice of bread, and stood watching it toast with the kind of focus usually reserved for major life events. When it popped up, he inspected both sides carefully and put it back in for exactly one more cycle. He did this every morning, and every morning the result was exactly the same. Mr. and Mrs. Finch sat in silence until Mrs. Finch said, "Jam." Mr. Finch nodded and passed her the small dish, though she had already reached for it. The young couple whispered to each other about the cereal choices, agreeing first on cornflakes, then switching to muesli, then deciding to have one bowl of each and share them. When they sat down, they swapped bowls twice, ending up with the exact same arrangement they had started with. The businessman finished his coffee, opened a small notebook, stared at a blank page for several minutes, then closed it again, as though a decision had been made. The elderly lady stirred her tea slowly, not because it needed stirring, but because it was something to do. In the far corner, the older man buttered his toast so carefully that by the time he finished, it had cooled completely. He ate it anyway, one slow bite at a time, chewing as though he had nowhere else to be, which, as far as anyone could tell, he didn't. Paula entered the breakfast room at 8:12, carrying a fresh basket of rolls. She placed them on the counter, as though revealing them to an audience, then stepped back to check they were in the right position. Satisfied, she adjusted the serving tongs by a quarter turn, so the handles lined up with the edge of the table. No one noticed, but Paula always did this part. It was the most exciting thing that would happen to those tongs all day. Kenneth walked through the room, not speaking, just giving a slow nod to each table, like a priest doing blessings. When he reached the coffee machine, he pressed the button once, just to make sure it was still dispensing coffee, and then left without taking the cup. The businessman glanced at the untouched coffee, but didn't take it either. It didn't feel like it belonged to him. Out in the hallway, Arena and Mela's trolley could be heard squeaking faintly. They were making their way toward room 12, pausing outside each door long enough to listen for signs of life before moving on. When they passed the breakfast room, they nodded once toward Paula. Paula nodded back. It was not a greeting exactly, more of a confirmation that the day was proceeding as planned. By 8:33, Mr. Ellis had finished his second round of toast. He pushed the chair back under the table, just enough to let everyone know he would not be returning. He nodded once to Paula. Paula nodded back. The Finches stayed a few minutes longer until Mrs. Finch said, "Tea, Mr." Finch looked at the empty pot and said no. They both stood at exactly the same time and left without another word. The young couple lingered longest. When they finally stood, they hesitated, unsure whether to carry their bowls to the counter. After a long pause, they left them where they were and walked out hand in hand, glancing back once as though the bowls might feel abandoned. The businessman drew a single line in his notebook, shut it with a sense of completion, and left the room briskly, but not so briskly that anyone could accuse him of being in a hurry. The elderly lady sat quietly for several minutes after her tea was gone, gazing out of the window as though waiting for something to happen outside. Nothing did. Eventually she stood and walked away with the slow confidence of someone who had no appointments for the rest of the day. When the room was empty, Paula began her closing ritual. She wiped each table in turn, straightened the chairs so their backs lined up with mathematical precision, and gave the serving tongs another quarter turn, bringing them back to their original position. Kenneth reappeared just as she was finishing, surveyed the room with a slow, approving glance, and said good. By 9:05, breakfast was officially over. The lobby was quiet again, the smell of coffee fading gently, the cups stacked, the tables reset. Somewhere upstairs, Arena and Mela's trolley squeaked twice, and then fell silent, as if even the housekeeping had decided to take a short pause. The hotel had entered its favorite time of day, the part where nothing much happened at all. At 9:17, Kenneth began his rounds. This consisted of walking slowly through the lobby, glancing at the corners of the room to check they were still where they had been yesterday, and then heading down each corridor in turn. He didn't knock on any doors. He just listened to the hush of the hallway, nodded once to himself, and moved on. In the breakfast room, Paula stacked the last of the cups, paused to look at the arrangement, moved 1/2 inch to the left, nodded. Satisfied, she switched off the coffee machine and got on with her day. Angela was behind the reception desk, sliding key cards back into their slots with quiet precision when a guest appeared, a man with a vaguely puzzled expression and a towel draped over his shoulder. He said the shower was slow. Angela nodded the nod of someone who had heard this before, wrote something down on a notepad, already half filled with similar notes, and assured him it would be seen to, which in hotel language meant Victor would be informed when he next wandered through. At 9:42, Victor appeared, carrying a screwdriver and a small bottle of oil, which suggested he was here for something mechanical, though it was never entirely clear whether he was on his way to fix something or had already fixed it and was now just holding the tools for effect. Kenneth mentioned the slow shower. Victor nodded once, walked toward the stairs, and disappeared for 20 minutes before reappearing, nodding again and putting the screwdriver back in his pocket. The shower had presumably been dealt with. At 10:05, the lobby plant received its weekly watering. Kenneth poured exactly the same amount of water he always poured, enough to keep the plant alive, but not enough to encourage unnecessary growth. He wiped one leaf with a tissue, stood back, and considered his work. It looked the same as before. Which was the result he was hoping for? Somewhere upstairs, Arena and Mela could be heard opening and closing doors with the soft, regular rhythm of people who had perfected their routine. The trolley squeaked once on the way to room 14, which was just enough to remind Kenneth that Victor would need to return later with the oil. At 11 o'clock, the lobby clock chimed faintly, not because it was an especially important hour, but because that was what it did at 11. Angela looked up from the computer, nodded to herself, and went back to doing whatever she had been doing before. The hotel, satisfied that the morning had gone entirely as expected, settled into its quietest stretch of the day. At 12:15, a delivery van pulled into the car park, its tires making a wet hiss across the puddles. Kenneth noticed it from the reception desk and stood for a full minute, hands on the counter, watching the rain drip off the mirrors of the van when the driver came in, leaving faint footprints on the lobby floor. Kenneth handed him the pen from the chain and waited until the man had signed before rotating the clipboard slowly to admire the neatness of the signature. In the kitchen, Christy lifted the lid on a simmering pot and let the steam rise slowly toward the extractor fan before nodding once and replacing the lid. The rain tapped gently on the high window above the sink, forming thin streams that gathered and slid down in unhurried lines. At 12:42, the vending machine beeped twice, the sound unusually loud against the soft patter outside. Angela walked over, pressed the button herself, and stood for a moment, listening to the rain on the glass doors at the entrance, before noting calmly on her pad, crisps empty. Victor was summoned. He crouched in front of the machine, tapped it gently until the packet fell, placed it carefully on top, and left without a word, his shoes leaving small, precise wet marks on the floor by the door. The hours drifted past, like the rain running slowly down the windows. Every now and then, a guest crossed the lobby, pausing, just long enough to shake a wet umbrella or glance at the puddles outside before heading back upstairs. At 2 o'clock, Kenneth polished the bell on the reception desk, then stood listening to the sound of water outside before giving the bell a small experimental tap. It rang once, a bright little note that sounded oddly cheerful against the muted afternoon. Kenneth nodded, satisfied, and went back to straightening the brochures by the door, which had curled slightly at the corners from the damp air. In room 8, Mr. Ellis found the same soap opera he had been half watching the day before. He lay back with his hands folded on his stomach when a character shouted something dramatic. He blinked once slowly and returned to staring at the screen. In room 10, Mrs. Finch put down her magazine and said tea. They sat in silence as the kettle boiled, and stirred their cups longer than necessary before taking their first sips. In room 15, the young couple stirred from their nap at exactly the same moment, as though cued by some invisible clock. One asked if they should go out. The other suggested they wait until later, and with that settled, they both stayed exactly where they were. In room 18, the businessman typed 3 words into his laptop, read them, deleted them, and typed the same 3 words again. In room 21, the elderly lady wrote a single word in her crossword, placed the book on the bedside table at a perfect right angle, then opened it again and began a new clue. In room 24, the boy lined up all the pillows along the floor to create an obstacle course. His mother told him to be careful without looking up. He hopped across them twice, then collapsed on the carpet laughing. In room 27, the older man found a nature program, a heron standing completely still in a river. He watched it as though the two of them were in some quiet contest. When the heron finally moved, he nodded once and turned the television off. By 4 o'clock, the guests began drifting downstairs. Mr. Ellis smoothed the duvet with both hands, put on his cardigan, and left the room with the quiet purpose of a man going absolutely nowhere urgent. The Finches put on their coats at exactly the same time and left without a word. The young couple put on their shoes at the same time, laces tied with matching levels of effort, and left looking faintly pleased with themselves. The businessman closed his laptop with a deliberate click, checked his watch twice on the way down the corridor, though there was nothing in particular to be on time for. The elderly lady tucked her crossword into her handbag, locked the door, and checked it twice. The boy's mother announced it was time to go downstairs. He leapt off the bed with enough enthusiasm to suggest this had been the plan all along. The older man gave the room one last slow look, switched off the light, and walked down the corridor so quietly. It was as if he had been part of the furniture all along. Downstairs, Paula had begun setting the tables for dinner, lining up the cutlery with the kind of precision that made it look more like a scientific experiment than a meal. Kenneth moved slowly through the lobby, straightening a chair by half an inch, then checking the time against the clock on the wall, as though confirming that the evening could now officially begin. By 5:35, the dining room had filled in its usual pattern, as if everyone had quietly agreed on which tables to sit at, without needing to discuss it. Mr. Ellis near the radiator, the Finches at the window table, the young couple opposite each other at the smallest table in the corner, the businessman nearest the door, the elderly lady in the same seat she had used at breakfast, the boy and his mother in the middle. Paula moved between the tables with her usual steady pace, replacing plates, collecting them again, with such quiet efficiency that she almost seemed to glide. By 6:20, the dining room was empty again, chairs pushed in, tables neatly reset, and now it was time for the evening. In the lobby, Kenneth sat at the desk with the reservation book open, running his fingers slowly down the page, as though counting something very important, even if there was nothing to count. Angela printed the day's receipts, stacked them in a tidy pile, and aligned them until the corners were perfectly flush. At 6:35, Victor passed through the lobby carrying a single light bulb, nodded to Kenneth, and went upstairs. 5 minutes later, he returned, carrying the old bulb like a trophy, nodded again, and walked out of the building without speaking. Irina and Mela returned their squeaky trolley to the housekeeping closet and stood together for a moment, discussing the next day's order of rooms in low voices, as if rearranging the sequence might have unforeseen consequences. In the kitchen, Christy was washing the last pan, letting the water run over it until it made exactly the right sound, then hanging it carefully on its hook. He stood for a moment, looking at the row of hanging pans, nodded once, and switched off the light before leaving the kitchen in perfect order. At 7:20, Kenneth walked a slow lap of the ground floor, pausing at each corridor to listen to the faint sounds of televisions and running water from the rooms above. Satisfied, he returned to the desk. By 8 in the evening, the corridors had gone quiet. Televisions glowed softly behind closed doors. The muffled sounds of game shows and weather reports seeping faintly into the hall. One by one, the guests settled in. Mr. Ellis folding his cardigan over the back of the chair, the Finches setting out their clothes for the next day, the young couple lying side by side, staring at the ceiling, as though waiting for it to say something. In the lobby, Kenneth switched off the overhead lights, leaving only the desk lamp burning. He closed the reservation book with a soft thud, stacked the pens neatly, and straightened the bowl of mints one last time. At 9 o'clock, Martin arrived for the night shift, nodded once, and accepted the keys and the day's notes with the quiet seriousness of a man receiving ancient instructions. Kenneth walked to the front door, checked that it was locked, then stood for a moment in the stillness of the lobby. Everything was in its place. He turned off the lamp, nodded to Martin, and left, the soft sound of the door closing behind him, marking the official end of the day. At 9:15, Martin sat at the desk with a fresh cup of tea and opened the log book to a blank page. He wrote the date at the top in slow, careful letters, then set the pen down and listened to the faint hum of the vending machine and the rain falling softly outside. Upstairs, each of the guests were preparing for sleep. The corridors were quiet now, the lights low, the rain steady and soft against the windows. Another day in the most boring hotel in the world had officially entered its night shift, and somewhere in the building, everything was exactly where it should be. The curtains hung still, the towels were folded, the brochures were straight, and in the lobby, the bowl of mints sat with its most colorful wrapper facing forward, ready for whoever might need it tomorrow. Sleep well, my friend.